Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Nice. And welcome to the first panel of MICE 2018. It's a pleasure to have you all here today, and I am especially grateful to our panelists being here today. I'm A. David Lewis, and my connection to all this is purely tangential. I work at the Massachusetts College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences. I'm their director of the Masters of Health Sciences program and a graphic medicine enthusiast. As we've done in previous years here at MICE, we've focused on other graphic medicine topics, so this is a continuing conversation. I'm pleased to say MICE has been focused on this for some time. Today we're going to address probably one of the largest areas of graphic medicine, namely mental health comics. And to help us engage in this conversation today, we have our panelists. Beginning from right to left, we have Lucy Bellwood.
Hello.
Thank you, Lucy, for being here.
Absolutely.
Kevin Budnik. Kevin, thank you for being here. L.B. Lee. Hello. Robyn Smith. Thank you. And Rachael Lindsey. Hey, let's give them a collective round of applause. So, just sort of a Robert's Rules of Order. What I'll do is ask each of the panelists to provide, in a sense, their own introduction to their works, how it relates to mental health. I know we have a number of additional artists and creators with us in the audience, and I hope they will identify themselves during the Q&A period we'll have towards the latter half of the panel. I have a few prepared questions, but frankly, I'm getting sick of my own voice. So, I'd like to start off with Lucy, if you wouldn't mind taking the reins and telling us some about you, your work, and mental health.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. So I make comics primarily autobiographical stories. For a long time, my gimmick was making comics about going on adventures. That is still somewhat true. I do tall ship sailing and whitewater rafting and turn those things into comics. But last year, my work took a bit of a turn towards dealing with issues of mental health, and I released a book called 100 Demon Dialogues, which is a collection of comics drawn over the course of 100 days, so one every day for 3.5 months. And they are all conversations between me and a character who I have identified as the personification of my inner critic. And that project was really instrumental in getting me involved with a lot of graphic medicine conversations and meeting a lot of new people and considering how comics can function as a form of therapy for fostering these kinds of discussions. So I'm really excited to be here, and I am located downstairs in the Eisner room at table E116, if you would like to come and find me after this, where I will be this afternoon. And those are some examples from the book of the types of comics that exist in there. They're all single panel, little black and white stories. I made a bunch of plush toys because I funded the book on Kickstarter, and there's nothing quite so fun as getting into a relationship with your inner critic and then replicating him 2,000 times. And then having to sell him off in pieces to other people so that they can take him home. There's a metaphor in there somewhere, but anyway, that's me.
Thank you so much, Lucy. Kevin, if you would do the honors.
Sure. My name's Kevin Budnik. I do primarily diary comics in sort of a daily format, like a 4-panel square daily format. I make a lot of work about anxiety and coping with anxiety and how that affects my personal relationships and my inner peace and stuff like that. I've been making diary strips since 2010. I started it as a way to sort of get myself in the process of making work on a regular basis. And it kind of took over my life, and it's become like an interesting way of expressing myself, and also sort of a strange way of coping with the depression and anxiety and all that stuff that sort of cropped up in my life since then. yeah, and that's just so kind of alternate out of different styles. I use a lot of watercolor and marker and pen. I draw really small. I like to be able to like draw as I go. I have anorexia. I'm a person who has eating disorder. I'm in recovery, but I make a lot of work about that. My book handbook was a sort of a collected singular thing that talks about my treatment with that. And I think that's everything. I'm in the baptismal room.
Okay.
Thanks for doing that. That sounds. Tell everyone where to find you. Yeah. I know, right? It's important.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And I will now yield the floor to LB.
All right, can everyone hear me all right? Cool, awesome. I'm LB Lee, and I make entirely mental health comics. Like, that's my whole bag. I sometimes do informational, I sometimes do self-help. I kind of got dragged backwards, kicking and screaming into more memoir-y stuff. But my whole goal has been to make comics about mental health, and it was kind of an accident. Like, my first exposure to comics that made me want to do it was actually Sam Keith, who did the Max and Zero Girl, and that made me realize that comics could be used to show, like, psychological phenomena in ways that no other medium can, except maybe arguably avant-garde film. And avant-garde film is a lot more expensive to make. So I kind of started making comics about it, purely, my first comic, which was MPD for You and Me, that it was shown earlier there. Like, I did as a college project just to finally make myself make a comic book, and then people asked if I could buy it, and if anyone ever asks you, can I give you money? The answer is always yes. So I just kept making it, and the primary thing I make about is trauma and dissociation, or more popularly known as multiple personalities. Because as far as I know, there is exactly one other multiple who has made comics in print about it, and that is Madison Clell, and she burned out and didn't finish when she was making Kuku. So I started making comics sheerly about it, sheerly out of spite and frustration, because there was so little anybody knew about it. Like, and also, I could always tell when I was seeing people that they knew just enough to know that if they asked me anything, they would probably offend me. And so they would just be paralyzed in this absolute, like, etiquette terror of knowing just enough to know they don't know anything and being too terrified to ask. And so I was like, what if I could give you this comic, friend, and you can hide in a corner and read it and have all your existential terrors, but you'll be able to have them on your own time, at your own pace, and then, if you feel like asking me something, you can feel assured that you won't, like, make me want to punch you in the face just by being in front of me. Even though, like, I generally have a rule that you can ask me anything first times, but you know what? Like, I'm sure it helps them feel better. Also, it means that there are certain questions now that I don't have to answer quite nearly as often. So, yeah, and I've been doing it ever since, and that's what I do.
Thank you so much, and I'm showcasing a few other of your titles up above, which we can address shortly.
Yeah, some of them are not mine. That, by the way, is from Kuku, the Mass and Clow comic I mentioned earlier.
Very good. Next, we have Robyn Smith.
Hi, I'm Robyn Smith. So I ended up getting into comics really late, maybe just 3 years ago, I think. I didn't think I'd be getting into comics, but I ended up going to the Center for Cartoon Studies and thought I was going to actually be doing action comics. But being that I was in White River Junction, Vermont, I realized very soon I was the only black person in town, which was a really rough ride, and I decided to do my first year project on the feeling of isolation. And so from then on, so I do a lot of like autobio, which is so this is sort of my only finished comic. The saddest and angriest black girl in town. I was the only black girl in town, so that made me, by elimination, the saddest and angriest. So it's just sort of, my life and how things build up, and so it's an autobio comic about that kind of like isolation. And have continued doing comics about the intersection of race and mental health. And now I'm working more on how race and like mental health intersect, but also immigrant status, because I'm originally from Kingston, Jamaica. So on top of that, just there are a bunch of layers to, I think, mental health that include these aspects of my identity, which is why I make the comics that I do. I am in the Hernandez room, if anyone wants to come say hey, but I think that's all I have to say now.
Thank you so much. I'm showcasing a few more of your pages up above. We'll get a chance to address them either individually or as a work in just a few moments. But I do want to have the opportunity to also speak with Rachael Lindsey.
Hi, I'm Rachael, and I've been making comics for my whole life. I've been doing autobio for about 20 years, and I have a comic strip in the paper 7 Days, which is Vermont's statewide alt weekly. I just came out with a book called RX, and it's been a project that I've been working on for a very long time, and it was actually conceived of when I was involuntarily hospitalized by my parents. And I just had been hell-bent on realizing that for the past 7 years. So I'm very proud that it's out. It's the story of when I graduated from college, I had to make a choice between being an artist and affording my medication. And this was before Obamacare, so I took a job with health insurance at an ad agency and was promoted onto the Pfizer account advertising antidepressants as a closeted mental patient. And during that time, I was forced to reflect on my own life and the choices that I had made and what the reality of the commodification of mental illness is in this country. And the system that controlled me and continues to control me in a lot of ways. And since the release, it's been really fascinating. I actually met David at the Graphic Medicine Conference in White River, and I've been getting an amazing response from the medical community in a way that I did not anticipate, and have been doing a little speaking tour over the past month or so. Having my release in New York at Mount Sinai Hospital, and just kind of continuing to see the interest amongst that population has been really fascinating, in addition to people who are connecting with that on a personal level because they, have bipolar disorder, which I don't know if I mentioned that, but that's what I have. But yeah, so I'm really excited to be here. Thank you, David.
Pleasure to have everyone here. One elephant in the room that I'd like to address, if we could, just at the outset, is that all of you are, or largely, each of you is working in a non-fictional or at least semi-autobiographical space. And I wondered if you might want to comment, either from your own experience or what you've observed, on mental health being used as a plot device in various narratives, in comics. LB, you called out that you understood that yours is the only other MPD comic focused on the reality of the experience, but I feel like it gets tossed into fiction all too often.
Ask me how I feel about Norman Bates.
Please, yeah. I do want to ask how each of you or any of you feel about that, how that's represented fictively in comics, and if you had an opinion about that. Not Norman Bates. I thought of actually Spider-Man antagonist Norman Osborn. That the villain must be the mentally unbalanced person. I don't know if you wanted to take things along that path, or we can go in a totally different direction, that the
I feel
fictive
like
elements of this aren't interesting at all.
I feel like I should keep my mouth shut because otherwise I will totally commandeer this entire portion. So I'm just going like, y'all go first.
It's okay if you have a strong feeling on it. Go ahead. Or Robyn, did you want to open up?
Well, I think when it comes to writing diverse characters, I think mental health is a really big part of writing like a convincingly like black character. Or I mean, there are just so many things going on in America right now and have always been going on that affect different races of people who are from different kind of marginalized, whether or not it's like race, class, etc. That mental health does play a very important part in whether or not you're writing a fictional character. Or, I mean, for one, that's definitely why I write autobio, because I feel like I can trust my own feelings and what I've experienced. And it's almost just making like a very giant I statement, like just being like, yes, this is how I feel about these things. And I mean, it is nice having people come up to you and be like, I feel this way also. Or I've had some people come and read the title and be like, that's me. And I'm just like, great. I'm glad that you feel validated by being the saddest, angriest black girl in town. I'm so sorry that that's happening to you, but I understand like that feeling of being like, yes, you feel that also. So I think for writing a fictional character, that's also what I want out of like reading another black girl's story, just being like, yes, same. So, I mean, in terms of like, not necessarily like the kind of like how Batman's villains are all like mentally unstable. So
and perhaps Batman himself, but sure.
Yeah, I don't have the answer for that.
Okay, so you trust the autobiographical experience more. It feels more genuine and it's less likely to be misused?
Depending on the person creating it, but I definitely like trust autobio a lot. I just feel like someone like puts themselves in a very vulnerable place, and me reading that, I feel honored to sort of, and I trust that.
That's an excellent point, that the fictive element of this doesn't expose the creators almost at all, unless they choose to be exposed through a character. So that's an excellent point.
Yeah, I find that if I make anything fictional, I just fictionalize my experiences.
Sure.
Just like a little bit.
Yeah.
Mentioning Batman villains, like I have other plural friends, but about the only time I have ever seen more than one multiple in a room in pop culture was an episode of Batman that would take place where the Arkham Asylum inmates take over. And like that's basically it. That's the only time I've ever seen more than one multiple in a work of fiction was in a Batman supervillain meetup. Which kind of boils it down. And like multiples, we're the serial killers, like we're the axe murderers, we're the people who make everyone very, very nervous. Because even if on some level they know that I'm not likely to pull out the axe and put on the wig and the dress and burst down on them in the shower, if that's all you see in pop culture, like multiples, we either get to be the axe murderer, who are always white men, or we're the saintly suffering martyry victim, who is always a white woman. If you're lucky, you might get to be like the manipulator who's puppet mastering everybody and may not be multiple at all, but like 90% of all of them are either the saintly suffering victim or the axe murderer.
And in each case there, it's a plot device, right? It's not a secondary characteristic. And it is, I mean, I think for everybody grappling with issues of mental health, like it is a defining characteristic of who you are, right? It's not that you want to be divorced from your experience being in White River Junction and to say, no, I don't want to talk about this because it's, because it is a huge part of the experience, but it's not the only part of your experience. And there's this tightrope to be walked, I think, in this kind of work between articulating the experience as it is lived and then also making room for showing coping, and coping is a difficult one, because there's that question that people will ask often of like, wow, I just don't know how you balance all of it, or like, you're doing so well, and you're like, am I though? I don't actually think I am. And that's a hard conversation to have with people, because then it's just playing into the sense of, oh, I'm fooling everyone. And it is a little harder. It's funny that you use the term, difficult that you use the term expose, right? For an author to expose themselves in the work, because there's also an element of commodification, that the honesty of those narratives is there's something addictive about it. We kind of can't look away from people being brutally honest, especially in public, because there's this sense of, oh, that's so brave, I couldn't do that.
Also, everyone loves a train wreck.
Yeah. And we all just want to rubberneck and like stare at the other person and be like, whoa, at least my life isn't that messy. But that's like a complicated, it's this voyeuristic, like complex thing. And personally, I find that I get really uncomfortable writing fiction. And I mean, all fiction is essentially an abstraction of personal experience to begin with. And that's maybe the hard thing about trying to write diverse characters, is that you have to really do your homework. And I still don't really, I think in the current climate I am trending more towards, I don't know enough yet. But then there's a next step, because you can't just say, okay, none of us know enough, no one gets to talk about anything else, we're all just gonna sit here. And I'm curious if any of you have had experiences reaching for narratives that aren't your own, and how you've approached going deep on understanding that from the perspective of, I have something about me that I would like other people to understand and reflect accurately. Kind of the big question.
Do you mean like that from the creator side or as a reader?
From the creator side. Given that we're mostly doing autobio, maybe not, but...
Can you clarify that?
Yeah, like if you... have there been instances in doing autobio work where perhaps you've also reflected the experience of a friend or a colleague or somebody you know who has a condition or a set of circumstances that are different from yours, and has that been challenging in like bringing friends into your stories, for example? Like, because I know for me, I had that experience of people saying, oh, I really relate to this book, which seems strange because it's literally just 100 drawings of myself. And I don't often bring other friends into my narratives, and that's something that I've always felt a little anxious about doing in autobio, I suppose.
Well, I think in my experience, I was having a manic episode, and I had a challenge interpreting reality and dealing with my relationships with other people. And my intention was to be honest. And, I requested my hospital notes in order to understand what was going on with me. And it was very difficult for me to trust myself in the narrative at points. And I feel like, I'm not depicting somebody else's illness, but I'm depicting sanity, and when I am not sane. So that was hard.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's really interesting, like because what you were saying is like, when you're depicting yourself and trying to relate your whatever you're going through in the moment, I find like it's really easy to get into that like feedback loop where you're like just talking at yourself and like trying to rationalize if the things that you're feeling are actually what you're feeling, and like is this all of my experience? Are these like emotions like real? Have I like written this before? Am I like continuing to just trot over the same ground? And going back to the conversation about like people coming up to you and saying that they identify with it, like I think that like when people approach comics about mental health, they're like it makes them feel more seen too, because like autobiographical work on its own does that, but then autobiographical work about mental health creates this sort of space for conversation about it, which is needed, and also like it makes people feel safe and seen and like they're not alone, which is like the core conceit of when you have mental health, you feel like you're alone. So if you see it reflected in any form of art, it makes you feel like there's other people out there who are going through the same thing as you, even if it's not necessarily 100% your affliction or whatever you want to call it.
That segues actually to another question I'd like to pose the panel. And LB, you touched upon this slightly, and I think Rachel touched upon this. And that is namely, when we look at graphic medicine, which is the intersection of the comics medium and really any form of illness, any expression of healthcare, any grappling with even a loved one's conditions, mental health is the one thing that we all share. We don't all share cardiac problems. Some of us do, some of us don't. We don't all share cancer. Some of us could, but not all of us do currently. But certainly mental health is something that people engage with daily. To what degree is your work an expression primarily of just your own experience? You just want to share your experience. To what degree is it an expression of letting others be seen, I think, as you said, to instruct others, LB, I think that's what you touched on somewhat, or just to make mental health more of a presence? I'm curious about greater motivations and wider motivations, because certainly you could have made any of these and then just tucked them away. But here you are, you're publishing them, you're selling them, you're sharing them, you're discussing them. I'd love to hear the drives behind that.
I felt like I needed to do this in a reclamation way of my personal history, and I did not feel like I wanted to have any agenda or to suggest that anything that I had experienced was the same as anyone else, because everyone has a unique journey, and it has bothered me that there are mental illness works out there that suggest, I mean, everybody needs a helping hand, but, I have a unique experience, everyone has a unique experience, and I never wanted to suggest this is a portrait of mania, or like this is the way that you get yourself out of this moment. And the goal was to just tell my truth and have people take away from that whatever they could take, because I just so did not want to have an agenda other than to be truthful and to that was important to me.
Yeah. I feel similarly about like just telling the truth and telling my truth. I think that's definitely like why I made the mini comic. But I also think like to instruct is a very like important part of my work, because I know I made it because I was like, it was so many things had happened. It was like, oh, this is the last straw. I mean, there was just an incident in a classroom, and I was kind of just over it at that point and realized that this was the only way that I could communicate what I wanted all these white folks to do around me, because there was no way for me to communicate that without like yelling or crying or also I find that I'm not, even though I'm here in front of you speaking, I'm not like the greatest speaker. I'm not good at like communicating. Especially like being from Jamaica, I think like I would communicate differently if I was there versus like here I'm in front of you trying to communicate in a way where you don't like think any less of what it is that I'm saying, which I think is also, pieces like it goes right back to like my mental health, because like certain accents can be conceived a certain way or perceived a certain way. I like have to alter the way that I express myself or the way that I say things, and that layered on top of the fact that like I'm trying to defend myself as like a Black person in America, which is like a new experience being from a different country. I found that making this comic was very important to me, and I definitely just kind of sat down and wrote for months, like through my experiences going on, like being in Vermont and then putting it all together. But towards the end, I realized, like after rereading it and doing it, I realized I was sort of telling everyone around me to kind of just leave me alone. Like, this is what I need you to do. I need you to like give me the space to like, I need you to just believe me, but also know that you can't help me. So, and I think that that was really important and like why I made the comic. And still, like I've made more comics since, but I think this is still like the truest comic to myself, and I hope to achieve something like this again. But I like you phrased it, to instruct, which is never something I've thought about before. So.
Sorry, it comes from just my wiring.
No, I love it. Thank you.
That I find that really interesting, and it makes me think about because I think making art or making comics like about your personal experience is often a reactionary thing, and like you were just saying, like you wanted to scream and cry and yell and stuff like that, but like instead of doing that, the only way to confidently and wholly express yourself was to take it back and like spend time with it and draw it out and write it out. And like that makes me think about like how much we learn about the stuff that we're writing about when we're taking that time to write it out. Like how much does that change or give us our own personal insight into our mental state? And like, because like you could just be like, here's like all the shit I feel right now and just get it out and away from you. But like there's something different about like constructing that and finding like a through line, and then like you're learning how to teach someone how to deal with you as a person. And like that sounds negative, but I don't mean it that way, you know? Like, yeah, I don't know, it's very interesting.
Do you feel like the actual process of the craft of making comics is an aspect of that? Because I've been, in hindsight, thinking about, like, it was so hard for me to do this. Mm-hmm. I was totally re-traumatized at every step, but I just found myself leaning into the craft so much and just being like, okay, this is my power to speed up and slow down, and like the sequencing of that and what is happening in between the writing and the drawings, like set up by the panels and the way that you move it through. Like, you know, I found that, you know, I was just trying to make my story something that the reader could experience, and I was able to, in a way that I could never do verbally or just with words, propel them through this at the pace that I wanted them to, like, feel like they were there and feel that experience. And do you feel that way about just like the process of structuring things and making books?
Yeah, I find that making things gives me a ton of closure, and I think there's also something to be said for it's a question of actually rewriting the narrative in some ways. Not that, like, to tell any version of events is to exclude certain other aspects of the feeling in that moment, right? Like, none of us are so omnipotent that we can craft a book that is going to capture every single nuanced aspect of the experience, but we can do it to the best of our ability. And I think it's interesting that you brought up craft, because that's the mechanism through which we're able to capture as much of that experience, or the, you know, tools of the trade that we use to craft something that, as you say, only in comics can or as you said, LB, that only in comics can express that particular feeling of a particular type of dissociation or anxiety, or like there are ways we can manipulate the page. But I think there's also, tying it back to what you were saying, Kevin, something about an instruction manual for me when I think about, especially for something like this where it was kind of a journaling exercise, and this book is a roadmap of how I felt all the ups and downs every day, because that inner critic voice goes from being, it's self-contradictory, right? It's either you're worthless, or like you're never going to be good enough, or we can do it all. And that those two things are like, it's not worth doing everything, or you have to do everything. That's the same voice, but taken on an individual daily basis, it feels like that's the whole story. And for me, I think the thing that I found therapeutic about crafting a longer narrative day by day was that I can go back and read it and understand, oh, you felt this way before on this day in 2017. And then the next day you felt totally different. And in hindsight, I think it's especially fascinating for me. We haven't really talked about our relationship to our actual drawing styles, as that we're talking more about content, but for me, drawing a lot of the time, that inner critic is particularly focused on my work and how it looks. And that fluctuation from, oh my God, this is the worst thing I've ever drawn, can't believe I'm putting this out, this is so bad, to the days when you feel like you're, you know, a god walking the earth and like sheer electricity crackles from your fingertips. Those are rarer for some reason. But when you look back, I cannot remember which pages in here I drew on days when I felt like hot garbage. And that's really informative for me, because I'm like, oh, it's almost like it's all in the mind. And it doesn't have anything to do with my hand-eye coordination of physically, like, has that occurred to any of you, or have you grappled with how mental health has intersected actually with the craft of drawing?
In my case, it's kind of weird and complex. Like Robyn, you mentioned sort of having to modify your presentation depending on your audience, and sort of the, you know, you alluded to how much energy just that takes. And I do it too, though obviously in a different realm. Like, I modify my vocal presentation, my body language, what pronouns I use for the benefit of a single audience. Like, I am modifying my behavior right now. There's a reason I can only do one con a month. It takes an immense amount of energy to maintain this sort of singlet facade. It's an immense amount of energy. I would say it's the biggest pain in the ass. Like, being legally disabled, yeah, that sucks. Mandatory poverty, oh yeah, that sucks. Flashbacks and the confusion, my brain trying to nuke everything on a regular basis, oh yeah. But God, just having to put up with other people. That's just the worst.
LB, that offers a segue to my last question, and then I want to open it up to the audience. I'm also, I'm not going to be checking text messages, but I'm going to take a peek on the Twitter feed just to see if remote people also have questions to pose. This is a little bit of an abstract theoretical question, but it does tie into craft and it does tie into presentation. There's work done by a scholar named Rita Charan, who wrote Narrative Medicine, and talking about the necessity in the healthcare field for doctors, nurses, all sorts of providers to have the tools to actually understand the stories that their patients are delivering in order to better understand their whole experience. Now, here's the question that comes out of that. I don't expect anyone to necessarily have a working knowledge of that, but she suggests that part of what people struggle with when dealing with any illness is the idea that they have become fragmented, is the idea that they've gone from some sort of whole state, W-H-O-L-E, whole state, while well, into a fractured self. And the hospital is a further fractured environment, as is taking pharmaceuticals, as is upkeep. I want to challenge that ever so slightly with what we just discussed. Is there a fiction that we're telling ourselves about wholeness, especially when we function in a necessarily, usefully fractured panel by panel medium that we're constantly linking together? That's my big abstract. That's my big abstract question. We are taking such benefit and power from and paneled, whether that's page by page or panel by panel medium. Does that perhaps challenge a fiction of wholeness, or do we necessarily need that fiction?
Boy.
Well, I have passionate feelings on that too, actually.
Please do.
sure
This is the forum.
Just because, like, that is actually a very common metaphor, or the way people think about being multiple, that we were one self and then we are fractured into these parts of people. And I would argue that one of the things I try and fight against most in my work is this idea, because there's a book, it's fiction, by Matt Ruff called Set This House in Order. It's about two multiples, like I won't get into it, but one of the things that stuck out to me from it is that the book mentions that there's this metaphor that people see multiples as a broken vase. That they're one person like you or you are a vase, and then someone drops it, and someone like me is just all these parts of a vase desperately trying to mimic vasehood. When the reality is more like a rose bush being torn up and thrown everywhere. And like the thing is, you know, rose bushes are actually kind of wussy, miserable creatures. So let's use aloe vera. Aloe vera will survive frickin' anything. Like, you chop it up and throw it all over the place, and like it'll try and take root again, and you'll get like a whole bunch of these different little plants, and yeah, they don't really look like they did before, but if you try and like chop them up and put them together into the plant they once were, you're not going to get anywhere. You are not going to like just magically fix. You know, you can't just glue this vase back together and hooray. But like probably the most popular idea of how multiples are treated is that we are put back together into one whole person and hooray, everything is fixed. And I've known people who have actually become a single person again, and it's a huge life transition and extremely stressful. I know that would actively resist such a thing happening to me because, like, imagine if basically someone says, okay, you, your family, and your friends all have to be one person now. You have to do all the laundry and all the chores and all the schoolwork, all of it yourself. And you're probably going to be very confused as to who you are because you're like a dozen people squished together.
Yeah.
And so, like, for me, the comic is almost like, to have it boiled down to pages and panels is very much like how we live our life. Like, our memory is all of these little bits and pieces, like the memory of my crappy dented water bottle because I fell on it when I slipped on ice once, or, you know, the sight of your earrings sparkling in the light, or, you know, people in the audience, or how the mics or your plushy demon. Like, our memory is made of all these little things that we put together. And with comics, we reconstitute through all these things. And all mediums do that, like the music in a movie, or, you know, the controls of a video game. You know, there are all these disparate little parts that you kind of stitch together. And even, so I debate the idea that wholeness necessarily means oneness. Like, those are two very different things, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And I like to think that I can be whole without necessarily being a singlet. And a comic can be a single work, even if it's broken down to 100 pages, 1,000 panels.
Yeah.
On that note, that was an excellent response, of course. I would like to open up the questions to the audience. Don't misunderstand me if I reiterate your question as mansplaining. I may just be doing it for auditory purposes.
I'm hard of hearing, so.
So, are there questions from the audience? Yes, you, please.
I do have a question with this sort of vulnerability of these autobiographical comics, because I find whenever I'm doing any sort of work about myself and my experience, there's something considered with the people who were in my life at that time. And sometimes, and not always, it may not paint them in the best light. And so I guess, is there this sort of subconscious level of not only fear, but you sort of slightly altering your retelling of that narrative when it involves other people, so that way either they don't get offended or they don't take it the wrong way and take it as oh gosh, they absolutely hated me at that moment, and, you know, they like resent me or something from it if you're retelling something in the past, sort of feel.
So this touches on something we addressed slightly before. You're expressing your own vulnerability in autobiographical comics, but then the presentation and relationship to others within those comics. Would that be accurate?
Yeah.
Thank you.
There's, I just read a really wonderful book called The Art of Memoir by Mary Karr, who's a celebrated memoirist, and I had just read one of her memoirs lit for the first time and then went to find other stuff, and she has an extensive passage in The Art of Memoir talking about how to fairly portray other people without ameliorating the circumstances of how you felt in that moment. And I won't summarize the whole chapter here, but it's definitely worth grabbing from the library or checking out. One of the things that she said that really stuck out to me was, in addition to, you know, doing your best to speak in I statements or to, you know, understand where you're coming from, I think in comics it's harder because you're drawing people, and just a drawing of somebody says volumes about how you feel about them, and especially drawing people you know is the hardest ever. Like, there's a reason I just draw myself, because it's hard to draw other people in a way that makes them feel, again, yeah, there is that degree of modulation and presentation. But she said something about quoting, that she doesn't use direct quotation marks when ascribing dialogue to other people. She'll say something like, I remember him saying something like, or I imagine they felt X. But it is there are always these small markers, these caveats, which I think arguably could be adapted for comics, that indicate you do not know another person's experience. And I suppose the most hurtful thing is to presume that you do. And if you're being honest to your experience and saying, look, I'm only human, I only know what I know, from my perspective, this is how I felt, bleh, you know, then at least it still requires emotional effort, and it does require like extra mental oomph. And my hat's off to you, because obviously I don't do that in my work, and I do think it's really hard.
I'm reminded of Eileen Comiskey-Crumb when she represents herself. Her representation changes from panel to panel. She does not look for a consistent representation even of herself. So we do have that option in comics to continually reinvent the other people you're depicting, not even getting locked into one particular form on a person.
I guess another question real quick about that would also be like their reaction to it, because I know like a lot of my family and friends, they're very invested in, you know, my work and what I'm doing, and then there's sort of like a fear of if there was, you're talking about like an abuser, I guess at some point, even if they're not in your life anymore, like as your presence grows and your work gets out there, like them finding out about it and then like trying to be like, that's not what happened or something.
Okay, so we don't want to delve too personally into tell us how your mother felt about this, but what would you like to offer here?
Just that I kind of have lived the nigh worst case scenario. So one of my recent books was a 2-year cult leader history of a cult leader I ran into who the online multi-subculture is chock full of cult leaders. Like, I banged into 3 of them within my first month. And yes, I'm a little bitter about that. So I did a history of this multiple who I found out, like, I only knew about one of his cults. He'd been running them for over 20 years. I made the book, and then I got ratted out by someone else about it, and he descended on me, and I was getting threats of violence, threats of lawsuits, the whole 9 yards, and like, the thing was, he was more or less a stranger to me. He tried to recruit me 10 years ago, we had a conversation, that was it. But he still like came down on me like a sack of bricks. And in my case, like, I had basically seen that coming, and I basically had to do all the thinking and be ready and like go through all my moral quandaries with the book before I ever printed it. Like, and if I had not been completely iron steady on it, like, it would have put me in a tailspin. But as it was, because I had been so exacting in my ethics of how I made the book, I was able to feel solid and secure, even as he, you know, was having people post my photo and my location at FlameCon and say, you should go beat LB Lee up. So I've had that happen. I also did a memoir comic involving my family, and my family found out about it, which was hilarious because my family did not care at all about my art until this happened. And the thing was, I probably would never have made the comic if I hadn't like specifically told my family, look, so-and-so and so-and-so are pedophiles. You need to stop giving them children. And they were like, how about we don't do that? I'm like, well, I mean, if the only thing you listen to is public shaming, game on. And that's why I did, and they found out and were deeply upset and offended, and I kind of had to make my peace with the fact that this was a thing that I was just going to have to live with, because the only other option was to actively help them hurt people. And I decided that I could not live with that.
We have another question here in the audience. Yes?
I'm a novelist, and I have mental illness, and so I really, really understand and have my experience with many of the things you're talking about. With regards to this particular issue, you own your own story. You're allowed to tell your own story, but you can change the names of other people. They can still be modeled, well, that's definitely my mother, but just change the name. And if they're going to be upset, they're going to be upset. This is your story, and you own it, and you're allowed to tell it. And people can't sue you for telling your story. They can tell their story, and you can change the name and say, if you can say in the beginning, you know, this is my story. I have changed the names, but this is my story, and you know, that works.
We have another question from the audience.
Rachel, I already know that your book is finding its way into med schools and everything, but I'm curious if anybody else on the panel has heard of their work making it into a medical school classroom or curriculum, or if anyone has reached out to you about making use of it in that way.
So there's interest here in, to the best of your knowledge, how has your work been used in clinical setting, instructional setting, medical settings? Would anyone like to address that?
I wouldn't say medical, but this is medical adjacent. I've certainly spoken to a lot of therapists since this book came out, who I was not familiar with this actually, but there is a school of therapy called Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, ACT, which is a therapist said, "Oh, I loved how you used ACT in this book to indicate this thing," and I was like, "What's that, please?" And they said, "Oh, it's a thing where you externalize your negative ideation and have a conversation with it and begin to develop empathy for the part of yourself that is like needy and scared and lost." And I'm like, "Oh no, I'm a terrible plagiarist." I didn't even know. It actually turns out that this led me to do some research, and the background of this concept of like listening to your negative thoughts rather than just squashing them down has its roots in Buddhist thinking. From hundreds and hundreds of years ago, there was a female monk who developed this theory of feeding your demons, it was referred to as. And I've got an essay brewing in me somewhere about this sort of there's nothing new under the sun approach. But ironically, having the plush toy, it wasn't just a merchandising ploy, it's actually been something that I think therapists have said, "Oh, the book is helpful, but this is more helpful because it's, it's cuddly enough that you want to like hug it, but then it's also its limbs fly around, so if you throw it down the stairs in frustration, it's very satisfying." And I think it has been easier for them to have conversations with patients using this as a stand-in and saying, "Okay, this is your inner critic, here's what it's saying, what are you going to do?" And that was really unforeseen and very powerful to me. There is something unnerving about that sensation of people saying, "Oh, this very personal thing that you thought was just yours is me also." And you're like, no, it's mine. It's my thing. But then it's also comforting at the same time, which is helpful. Anyway.
Some of my one-pagers especially, and some of my miscellaneous other books have been bought in bulk by mental health providers around the country. I think like my record right now is 4 different states. It's been a while, but it does happen periodically.
We've got time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Yes?
So there's a lot of pressure in narratives to come up with like a tidy ending or to have like, something happens at the end, like it's all a package. And I'm wondering if you've felt pressure at all putting together your pieces. Do you feel pressure to like, well, I can only really, I have to have healed myself by the end of this story, or there needs to be, I have to have learned something by the end. It can't just be, here's a bunch of my mental condition on some paper, here's a book.
I had a really hard time dealing with that. Like landing in ambiguity is one of like the least satisfying things at the end of a book. But I struggle with my illness every day, and I am still a part of the system that landed me in the hospital, and I still have to participate in being medicated and all of the rules of that. So I found that extremely challenging, but it was so worth figuring it out because it reflects reality.
Okay, another question from the audience. Yes?
So I'm a trauma therapist in the clinic. LB, I do some of your work. I do some of your work in my work as a trauma therapist.
Oh, cool.
What state do you work in? Okay. All right. Just didn't know if we needed to add to the inventory.
I'm always looking for mental health comics to work with my clients. As writers or as people who are publishing, trying to get work out, what do you think is the best place for other people to find your work or to find other mental health related comics?
So access points for mental health comics. Yeah.
That's a tricky one because unfortunately, like a lot of the people I know, it's sort of one of the things that if you're disabled, it's very hard to actually get people to publish your work. Like, I get very angry when I hear about J.T. Leroy because I'm like, the only reason you were able to reach that level of fame is because you didn't actually have the disabilities you claim to have. Because if you had those disabilities, you'd be too busy like trying not to die every day. You wouldn't have time to publish a book and get an agent. But so a lot of these comics I only know of because I personally know the creators. Like, and a lot of them are just smeared out. Like, for instance, my books, the best way to get them is through my webpage, and I still have to use like 3 different shop websites just to sell them. because Etsy like has very hardcore file limits, so it's pretty much impossible to sell ebooks on it. And then Gumroad, I just got kicked off of because of that cult leader, so I have to move all my ebooks somewhere else. And I might have to split off the cult book and sell it somewhere else purely so it won't take down my entire ebook web presence if he comes down on me. Like, it's very complicated. And this is just, I mean, mine is probably unusually complicated. Most people don't have an angry cult leader on their back. But, like, it means that, like, to find...
We're going to do that as a panel next year.
Like,
So you
to
have
find
an
these
angry
comics, you don't have to know the creator. Like, sometimes people can scrape into graphic medicine, but I haven't been able to because my disabilities forbid me from saving the money to allow me to go to the event.
I don't want this to be any sort of overpromise or official announcement whatsoever, but there has been talk in graphic medicine about whether or not a shop or some sort of clearinghouse online can and should be created for all sorts of different illnesses, but mental illness included.
That'd be wonderful. Like, there's a place in Newton, I think, that does like professional books or something that's all like mental health books. I tried to get in with them and they're like, oh, we don't sell comics. So,
But then the
again,
presence of graphic medicine, like as a field, I think, or as a hashtag to go look at online, like certainly it's not, I have found that it's not just people attending the conference who are using it increasingly, and that's been fascinating to see. It's certainly only come across my radar in the last 2 years maybe, but it's been around for much longer than that. And that has been heartening to see of like, oh, you could go to this hashtag and see what people are talking about, what's being shared. But that again feels very, you're probably already on that, and like there should be other outlets, and I think a singular distributor service or online shop would be really cool.
We have time for one last question, but I do have to defer to one of the people in charge of graphic medicine. Probably needs to make a caveat on my statement, or...
Not a caveat, well...
A little bit of a caveat.
That's like the dream. But
that's the dream, yes.
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 My plug is really that if you have work relevant and autobiographical and medical related, to send it to us, and we do our best to like get it out there so people know it's there. Send it to where? And you can just go to graphicmedicine.org or find me on Twitter.
We have time for a 30-second question. Yes?
I guess kind of in terms of fiction, you mentioned like kind of the more negative representations of mental health. What are all your thoughts on using in like a fiction or more on like fantasy, for example, kind of using it to work through mental health or whatever, like using it to work through what you're going through, like kind of personify, or there's multiple methods, but kind of so like I think one of the ACTU that Lucy mentioned was like separating it from yourself, but kind of using the art form and storytelling of comics to work through the issues internally.
So comics fiction as a work for good in terms of processing mental health issues. Is that fair?
Right, but also in a fictional kind of like...
Okay. Yeah. Would anyone like to touch on that?
I'm in favor. That being kind of what I did for my book. I think it's very helpful.
All in favor? All opposed?
Great.
Abstentions? One more time, let's thank our panelists today. Thank you for coming. Please visit their tables. Give generously. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dave. That was great.
Thank you.
Conscientious.